Hello, fungi friends, and welcome to this special episode of the Fascinated by Fungi podcast. Today I'm going to talk about the spookiest and most frightening fungi I can think of. So it's been a while since I've done new episodes, and this is just going to be a one-time special thing because we're getting close to Halloween, and I wanted to talk about all these spooky fungi that I've been thinking about. And while there's a lot more frightening things that potentially happen in the fungal kingdom, I'm going to go over some of my favorite sort of frightening and just weird looking fungi that evoke a lot of things for people. So there's a lot of depth in the fungal kingdom, and I think as we head into the second season, which I'll get into at some point, I'm going to try to rehash some of the topics we talked about last season, but break them down even a little bit more and get into the different ecologies and some of the different ways that fungi and mushroom live their lives. I've been hard at work on my book, and that's kind of been my priority, which is why I haven't started here on a second season. I'm also hoping to get a sponsor potentially because I don't get paid to do this podcast, and it's a lot of time and effort to put into something that doesn't necessarily have a benefit. I do hope there's a benefit for you guys to listening to this, and I've gotten a lot of positive feedback from people who've listened to my episodes and really benefited and learned from it. And so that's, to me, that's a huge payoff just to hear that people have appreciated my work. But if you do want to support me in a tangible way, you can subscribe to my Patreon. You can order some merch off my website. I have cool original t-shirt designs and other things on there. If you like any of the designs, but it's not on a product you like, just let me know. I can make that happen for you. You can use my discount codes for North Spore, for Far West Fungi, for a couple other things. Links to that are on my website, but those kinds of things do pay off a little bit for me, and I appreciate every little bit of support that I get from you guys. If you don't have money but you want to support me anyhow, please consider just sharing my content, my podcast, my videos with friends and family. I love to get feedback that people have been inspired to go out into nature and get foraging and sort of just learn more from having interacted with my account. And so to me, that's awesome. And it's amazing to kind of get the feedback from you guys. And I feel so lucky and so privileged to be able to reach so many people. And it's been just an amazing experience. So anyhow, let's jump into talking about these spooky, freaky fungi. So one of the things, and I'm not going to talk about this as a specific mushroom, but one of the things that people don't think about all that often is that there are carnivorous fungi. A lot of fungi originally started out as these aquatic parasites, and they would frequently shoot a little harpoon into something and infect it with mycelium and then kind of start this cycle over again. So there are these little free-swimming aquatic fungi that have a bunch of different methods for how they can infect and parasitize and potentially eat carnivorously different other small protists and algae and things like that. But there are a number of white rot fungi, oyster mushrooms, wine cap mushrooms, some other white rot fungi that actively trap nematodes. So they put out these little lassos, and a nematode, which is a microscopic worm, swims along in the wood and enters one of these lassos, and then the lasso senses the movement of the nematode, constricts, and sucks all the nitrogen out of it. So if you didn't know that fungi eat small animals and can be carnivorous, well, now you do. I think that's a pretty spooky fact. So I'm going to jump in with what I think is probably just the most visceral, there we go, viscerally just spooky, crazy, weird looking mushrooms out there, and it's absolutely one of my favorite ones to find and photograph. It is the devil's tooth, bleeding tooth, or Hydnellum peckii, sometimes known affectionately as strawberries and cream. Although if you've seen the videos I posted on Instagram and TikTok, it does not taste good. And I'm not going to get into my definition of edible, and I'm going to call it non-edible because it's bitter, tough, gross. It's unpalatable, also non-edible. Anyhow, I'll leave that for later. It is a Hydnellum, so it's a mycorrhizal mushroom, and it's often found growing in association with pine. It starts as these little sort of finger-like nubs that come up from the ground. And when it's growing very, very quickly, it's covered in these red, bloody droplets called guttation. And it's basically mushroom sweat because mushrooms are growing quickly. They're producing water and CO2, and that water is full of tannins and polyphenols, which lends it this absolutely wild red color. If you touch it, it'll kind of stain your finger, a little orangey red. If you taste it, it's very bitter, very astringent. I don't recommend it. I don't think it's poisonous, and I don't think there's a real danger in tasting it, but it's not a pleasant experience. But if you really feel compelled to, I think you can taste it safely. Anyhow, these little sort of white nubs are covered in these like red droplets, and it's just absolutely surreal to find these things coming out of the forest floor. I found a nice patch of them up in Jug Handle State Park in Mendocino, where they're growing with a pine, but I've heard from a lot of people all over Mendocino that they're pretty common. I spent years looking for them, and when I finally found them, I freaked out because they're just so cool looking. But those are just, absolutely wild, white, red, just deeply bloody mushrooms, and I think they're pretty spooky. A lot of people tend to get trypophobia from the kind of like irregularly shaped droplets on them. I also have to give a shout out to the blushing rosette or abortoporus. It can look fairly similar to the Hydnellum pecii, although it's usually sort of a mass of white stuff covered in those little droplets. It also looks kind of freaky and can activate people's trypophobia response. But I think that that's one of just the absolute spookiest, weirdest looking mushrooms that's out there. Another one comes up frequently whenever I make one of these little spooky fungi compilations is devil's fingers, or the octopus stinkhorn. It's a Clathrus archii. It's a sort of a crazy red demogorgon mouth looking thing that sprouts out of the ground. So stinkhorns usually start out as these little white egg shaped things, sort of the size of a golf ball just about. It's got sort of a tough leathery white membrane on it. And as it matures, the inside of it, which is sort of a tightly packed gleba, for lack of a better word, it is a mass of stinky spore stuff. And there's these sort of Clathrus archii opens up into these sort of finger-like, weird star mole mouth projection looking things. There's these sort of red finger things that span outwards, and they're covered in little bits of black goo, and that goo is what's called the gleba. It's the spore-containing thing that stinks to high heaven. It is full of dimethyl sulfides, aldehydes, ocenine. I think I'm trying to figure out what all the compounds are. There's a lot of things in there that stink, but mainly it's these dimethyl oligosaccharides. It's a bunch of sulfide compounds, just smell like rotting flesh and death. But that attracts flies. And those flies crawl all over this mushroom, covered in sticky gleba, and then they go crawl over other things like poop and whatever flies are attracted to, and they transfer the spores. So these Clathrus mushrooms are, I think, originally from sort of Australia, New Zealand, but because of the international timber trade, they've been spread all around the world. So you can find them pretty frequently in like wood chip beds that have been irrigated. But they're absolutely wild. And it's really, really cool to see a time-lapse video of one of those stinkhorns opening up. That's just absolutely mind-blowing. So they was reading about them. Ecology-wise, I guess they secrete a fair amount of oxalic acid and change the soil pH, and that changes the bioavailability of different minerals in the soil. They also do some calcium pooling, and then can kind of affect the microbiome of the bacteria and the other types of fungal species that grow there in that environment. So it's pretty cool too that they have this sort of ecological role, and they're also working to manipulate animals via these incredible scents, secondary metabolites that they make. I don't recommend eating them, but I believe they are technically edible, mediocre edible, very much so. Oh, my cat's gonna go off. So my cat's old. She's okay. She's just complaining. Her hip hurts. Tiger Pod, can we? Okay. She'll be done in a second. Okay. So this is what I get for doing a live podcast. Okay. Thank you, Tiger Paw. There's her input. Next one on our list is Dead Man's Fingers. So this is another one that whenever I make a compilation, people are always like, what about Dead Man's Fingers? And I'm like, well, I don't have great footage of those, but they are absolutely wild looking, sort of black knobby finger things that are often growing out of like the base of trees or out of dead wood. There's Xylaria polymorpha, and they can have a lot of different forms. Part of why they're called polymorpha. There's a whole bunch of different forms, but this dead man fingered form is kind of these like weird little black obelisk looking finger things that come up, and they're ascomycetes. rather than basidiomycetes. The devil's tooth and the devil's fingers are both basidiomycetes, so this is an ascomycete fungi. A lot of these Xylaria are endophytes, so their asexual form lives inside of the host plant, and then when a branch falls off or a leaf falls off, that Xylaria is one of the first organisms on the scene to suck up all of the available carbon and nitrogen from that dropped piece of plant matter. So they form these sort of black, knobby, finger-like projections, usually growing there out of wood. And they're covered, if you look very closely at them, they're covered in these tiny little dots called parathecia. And those are essentially little holes full of ascospores. And ascus is kind of this like needle-shaped projection full of ascospores, ascomycete spores. And for this species, it actually is a pretty slow maturation. Most ascospores mature quickly and disperse. This is going to take several months, and I think it's because those deadsman fingers can last a long time. They're full of a lot of weird polysaccharides and other things that would inhibit mold and other bacteria, fungi, etc. So those ascospores are going to be dispersed slowly because this mushroom can live for a very long time. But as with many other ascomycetes, it can also produce asexual conidial spores on its surface. So if you see one of those kind of dead man fingers things covered in a white sheen, that's probably the conidia ascospores being dispersed, or I guess the asexual spores. So dead man fingers are another weird, freaky, kind of spooky fungi. We also have the devil's urn, which is a black kind of jelly cup fungi. You often find that growing on oak. Again, like many other ascomycetes, it has an asexual form that's an endophyte inside of oaks and actually causes it's a plant pathogenic disease called Conoplia globosa, which causes these weird oak cankers. So you'll find it, both infecting the oak in its asexual form as well as growing parasitically, sort of reciprocally on oak wood in its mushroom form, its telomorphic sexual stage. And so they're kind of black on the outside. They have a little bit of a dip on the top because it's kind of a cup fungi. And then if you cut them in half, they're sort of a clear jelly-like substance inside. They're usually considered inedible, but I have heard some people say they've cooked and eaten it without ill effect. I saw some quote from some mushroom guy saying it didn't taste as bad as he thought it would. It's not exactly an endorsement, but maybe you could try it. I'm always a little sus about trying like ascomycete jelly fungi. They're really cool. I just like to play with them and look at them rather than be worried about eating them. I was reading a little bit about the sort of biochemistry of this mushroom, the devil's urn, Urnula criterium, and saw an interesting thing that said in aspens, I guess, as an endophyte, it produces some compounds that are antagonistic to some of the different pathogens of aspen trees. So like there's a sort of little swimmy fungi-like thing that can infect aspens, and this mushroom is where this endophyte is antagonistic to it, which potentially puts it in a role of sort of being a protector of the tree, being part of the microbiome of aspens. So maybe it's pathogenic on oaks, but actually beneficial for other fungi. And that's, again, really cool that a lot of these ascomycetes have these sort of like second lives, that they live in this asexual form where they act very differently from their environment and against other organisms than they would in its sort of sexual mushroom forming phase. So we're going to go from kind of dead and devils like things to witches now. So we have a witch's hat, Hygroscope conica or Singeri. It's a big group with a lot of diversity in it, but generally they are slippery, relatively large, kind of yellow to red to orange-ish mushrooms. They're bigger than some of the other waxy caps. A lot of waxy caps are fairly small, but these ones are relatively large, a couple inches high. They have a big, wide cap as it matures, and it goes from being kind of this yellowy orange red to just jet black. And you'll find these little stands of things going from yellow to like looking like they're covered in mold or some blackness, but it's just kind of the slow oxidation of the mushroom as it matures. And it turns into these freaky little black things. They call them witches' hats because they have the perfect kind of like little conical radiating outwards thing to make it look like a witch's hat. So they're mycorrhizal with hardwoods and conifers, but I've also seen them growing sapropically in grass, especially in the UK. A lot of these hygrosobe and waxy caps grow in grass, so it's kind of cool to see that. But they're definitely spooky, slimy shrooms, and that's always fun. We also have witch's butter. And so there's a sort of orange witch's butter as well as black witch's butters. The orange witch's butter are Tremella mesenterica or Auranticum. And these are evolutionarily ancient mushrooms that evolved very long time ago. And it's kind of interesting to think about the form and function of mushrooms, but some of the original kind of like actual mushrooms that are still around are these weird globular jelly things, kind of amorphous. They look very different from something that has a cap and a stem and gills. Instead, there's just these globs of jelly. But they're really interesting from an ecological perspective because they are actually parasitic on the mycelium of crust fungi. So I believe Auranticum is parasitic on Sterium, false parchment fungi, and the Mesenterica is parasitic on the Piniophora crust. I might have gotten those reversed, but either way, they're parasitic on the mycelium of crust fungi. So they're growing on wood, but they're actually parasitizing the mycelium of another species in the wood. Pretty cool. I don't know how that evolved exactly, because chicken or egg kind of thing, but very cool. Another interesting thing about those tremellas is in their asexual form, they actually form a yeast. So for a long time, people thought that mushrooms are like fungi that they couldn't observe the sexual stage were lumped in this thing called deuteromyces or imperfect fungi. And it turns out that a lot of these imperfect fungi were really just like the asexual form of a different fungi. And it was just, they had to kind of learn how they were the same. And we didn't really start figuring that out until we started doing DNA sequencing. So it's really cool to see the advent of new technology helping us to better understand all these different forms of fungi and realizing that many of the things we thought were different are actually the same. And it's really just an asexual versus sexual form of the same fungi and how they can look so different. You know, how does something go from being a little free swimming yeast, or not swimming, but a little single celled yeast to being this big globular jelly thing? Pretty neat. There's also a bunch of really cool immune stimulating polysaccharides like xylan and mannan containing polysaccharides in some of the fruiting bodies of these witches' butters, and those can have really good like immunostimulatory effects and things like that. So pretty cool stuff. There's also what are called the black witches' butters, and that's Exidia nigricans and Exidia glandulosa. It's really hard to tell the difference between those unless you have a microscope, but those are also wood decay fungi, kind of globular jelly things that happen to be black or very, very dark brown, and you'll see those growing on wood. So those are also pretty spooky, I think, when you find them. So we're going to transition into some stuff that is actually kind of poisonous. And I think some of the things that are poisonous can also be pretty freaky, pretty scary. So one of the ones that comes up to me when I think about spooky fungi is Satan's bolete, Rubroboletus. So there's Satans and Eastwoodii and lots of different species out there depending on where you are in the world, but they all have relatively similar morphology in that they tend to be larger mushrooms with tan caps, red pores, and a very large bulbous base. And when you cut them, they stain blue very quickly and a very dark blue. It's not an irregular or slow blue staining reaction. It's fast and it's dark blue. And they have those red pores. And usually if you see all those things together, you should definitely avoid eating a bolete like that. There are some similar looking boletes that are hard to tell apart, like the liver bolete, and so I don't recommend that beginners start trying to look for those mushrooms because it's probably just better to avoid red pored boletes that stain blue quickly, right? Just be safer that way. There is some reticulation on the stipe of the Satan's bolete, but it's not as crazy as the reticulation on like a frost bolete, which is also a very crazy looking mushroom, but that one's not poisonous or particularly spooky. It's just awesome looking. So the Satan's bolete can cause really severe nausea and GI pain, vomiting, even bloody diarrhea if you consume it. And that's because it contains this toxic enzyme, bolestein, something like that, which inhibits protein synthesis. And so if you inhibit enough of your protein synthesis in your body, you're going to get very sick. And so some of those symptoms can be an delayed onset as well, which is another good reason to avoid eating something like that, because the delayed onset symptoms tend to be more severe and very scary because you don't always necessarily exactly relate them to what you ate. If they onset a few days later, you might not recognize you ate a poisonous mushroom. And then it's harder for doctors to treat as well because they can't just like pump your stomach and get rid of it. They have to look at other ways to try to rectify issues that are happening. So A really scary one out there is the Deathcap, Amanita phalloides. And so that is a mycorrhizal mushroom that often grows in association with oaks, although it can grow with conifers. It's got this sort of pale, sickly green cap, a pretty well-defined large bulbous vulva, a good skirt or anus, and you should really just get familiar with what death caps look like if you're interested at all in mushroom foraging, because they're a good habitat indicator, but they're also a very sort of creepy, scary mushroom, and they're spreading, which is very troublesome because they're an invasive species from Europe that's spreading all over North America and supplanting other endemic species. And it's not great that we're getting this very, very toxic mushroom spreading all around the world. It's also one that is responsible for a lot of deaths associated with mushroom foragers, and people who are getting into mushrooming should be very aware of what the death cap looks like so you can avoid it. So the toxin in these death caps is amatoxins, usually alpha and beta amatoxins. So these are little cyclic peptides, usually 8 to 9 amino acids, and they bind irreversibly to your RNA polymerase II, which is the primary enzyme that is doing transcription. So it's turning your DNA into different forms of RNA, which then get translated into protein. But if you shut down that enzyme, and what it does is these amatoxins sequester all that enzyme out of your liver, and so your liver can no longer make any proteins, and liver essentially shuts down. Your liver and kidneys are particularly affected by these amatoxins because that's their sort of the filtration detoxification system of your body. So these amatoxins go there, bind up all your RNA polymerase II, and then you get very, very sick. Usually the full symptoms don't manifest until like 2-3 days after consumption, which is again a very scary thing like I was talking about with the delayed onset of symptoms, because you may not know that you need to go to the doctor and get treatment right away. But the sort of best way to treat those things is to essentially like pump your stomach and try to knock that stuff out. There are a few things they can do for you now. So I think that most people who go and seek treatment are now able to survive eating a death cap or consuming some amount of amatoxins. It used to be sort of automatically deadly, and now there's some things they can do to help save your life. But you may always live with some degree of organ damage, although I've heard reports of people actually being able to make a full recovery. So, the better thing is to just be very, very, very careful with amanitas and be fully aware of what something like a death cap looks like. I've done a bunch of posts on those if you'd like to watch those videos. I was also looking up some of the historical context for this stuff because the death cap and some other amanitas can be mistaken for something like a puffball or like a field agaric when they're really young, when they're just sort of a little white ball. So you should always cut those things in half and make sure that they are what you think they are and that there's not actually an amanita egg hiding inside. But one of the Holy Roman emperors, I think it was Charles VI, was apparently died about 10 days after eating like a big mushroom meal, which is consistent with the symptoms and toxicity of amatoxin poisoning. And that led to the War of Austrian Secession. And I think Voltaire actually said that, that mushroom changed the history of Europe because there was a massive sort of socio-political shuffling around Europe after that emperor died. So yeah, definitely know what death caps are and be aware of them. There's another freaky one out there. The jack-o'-lanterns are Omphalotus. So there's a couple different species. There's illudens, there's olivacins. There's another one, what's called the ghost mushroom. I think that grows down in Australia. And it's most of these Omphalotus are sort of bright orange. The olivacins one is a little bit more greenish orangey, and then the ghost one that I think is in Australia is more white. But they're all bioluminescent fungi, and so they'll glow at night. They actually generate their own light, and it's been hypothesized that maybe it's to attract insects to then act to help spread the spores around, although the actual mechanism for why it does that isn't fully clear. But it is absolutely one of the coolest things to see this mushroom glowing a green color at night. And the more mature specimens glow more because, I don't know, maybe the spores are more mature and so they're attracting more bugs. Again, we don't totally understand. But these mushrooms are quite toxic. And they're not like deadly toxic in the way that the death cap is, but people can get sick for several days. And if you read into it, the compounds that are toxic in them, the illudens, cause pretty significant DNA damage, and the only way to really get around it is like to resect and fix that DNA. So I think that eating jack-o'-lanterns could also be carcinogenic and thus could be a factor in causing cancer later on down the road. So I would be, again, very, very careful with finding and handling jack-o'-lanterns. I don't normally say that, most mushrooms are probably safe to touch, and I've touched jack-o'-lanterns, but I'm not going to be touching them a lot in the future, especially the more that I learn about the compounds that are in them, because I don't know if those can really diffuse across your skin, but I don't want to chance it. And I've talked to at least one person who said he carried a whole bunch of jack-o'-lanterns on a hike and then he felt kind of sick afterwards. So I definitely recommend being very careful with the jack-o'-lantern mushrooms. They're very, very cool to find them and photograph them when they're glowing. And you can always bring a specimen home, handle it carefully, put it in a closet, and maybe set up some slow exposure photography to really capture that freaky green glow that they give off. But those can be mistaken for chanterelles and some other kind of orangey mushrooms. So it's a very good idea to understand what jack-o'-lanterns look like. But they're pretty freaky fun fungi. Let's see, there's another one, the fire coral, Podostroma cornudeme, I believe it is. And this is something that grows in Australia and in Japan. I'm sure it grows other places too, but this is where I've seen majority of the reports of symptoms and poisoning coming from. So this one actually contains some mycotoxins that are sesquiterpenes, and so these are things that are amphipathic, which means they can cross your skin barrier. Most of the toxins in mushrooms we've talked about, specifically like the amatoxins and geromithrin and some of this other stuff, they don't cross your skin because they're not polar compounds, but these amphipathic molecules have both kind of polar parts and non-polar parts, and so they can cross through your skin and you can absorb a toxic dose by holding it. You'd have to really hold it for a long time or touch it a lot to get real poisoning from a mushroom like this. Usually I've heard people can safely handle this mushroom. Maybe they get a little bit of contact dermatitis, but these sesquiterpenes are no joke. There's one called satratoxin, and there's a whole bunch of other ones in this mushroom as well. They can cross your skin, and it happens in a couple different phases, but they can cause really severe GI symptoms, so throwing up, diarrhea, nausea. It ultimately leads to a loss of red blood cells, and you can get a depletion of like your lymph system and almost complete death of your white blood cells and leukocytes and stuff like that. So that's very bad. That would severely suppress your immune system. And I think there is some science going on to look at how to like use some of those compounds in like medical and therapeutic ways, but you would never want to like actually eat this mushroom or handle it or consume any amount of it. And the fire coral is just something that looks, it's like red and angry looking. It looks like you shouldn't touch it. And it's one of the few mushrooms that I would say it looks like you shouldn't touch and you should not touch. All the other things I've mentioned for the most part, you can touch. I wouldn't go ahead and touch jack-o'-lanterns a lot, but again, you could probably, I've held them before and I've had no issues. I just wouldn't touch them a lot, and I'd be fairly careful with working with jack-o'-lanterns. And I've dried some before for dye purposes, but I wouldn't dry them in my house. I wouldn't want to be breathing the spores, and I would also be pretty careful about cross-contamination in my dehydrator and wanting to like wash things pretty carefully afterwards. So let's see, we're going to get into some other freaky fungi. Cordyceps are probably one of the ones that, people constantly think of when they think of like zombie fungi and sort of crazy ecological interactions. So there's cordyceps and ophiocordyceps. So these are ascomycete fungi that infect insects. So they live a lot of their life as an asexual form in the soil. And then when that spore or asexual form senses the presence of like a larvae or an egg or sort of a nascent insect thing, it will kind of use its hyphae, which are these little fungal cell tips, and pry opening into the carapace of the insect and start growing mycelium inside of that insect. And it will then diploidize itself and become its teleomorphic sexual form, the zygote, and grow mycelium all through the body of the insect in what's called the hemolymph, because insects don't actually have a circulatory system in the way that humans do. They don't have distinct blood vessels. Instead, they have this kind of like nutrient broth of like organy stuff inside of them called hemolymph. And so it's easy for the mycelium to grow through it and suck all the nutrients out of the insect's system. Basically, it's parasitizing it and eating it. And it's releasing a lot of secondary metabolites into the insect body, into the hemolymph, that can have sort of psychological effects on the insect and not necessarily make it aware that its body is being digested. And the mycelium itself is actually able to, through hydraulic pressure, locomote the insect around. And so this happens with like ants, that the ants that have become, something like 80% of the body weight of the ant is now mycelium. And the ant is directed to crawl up this branch till it gets to this sort of specific point, and then the mushroom will, the ant will lock onto the branch, and the mushroom will then fruit out of its head and sort of rain spores down below, causing the cycle to start over. So these cordyceps are just absolutely wild, freaky fungi that kind of turn insects into some of these like, zombie-esque type things. And there's a huge variety of different morphologies of these cordyceps, and they're just so cool looking. I know I've recommended this before, but go check out Damon Tai on iNaturalist. He has some incredible photos of different kinds of cordyceps species that he's found down in the cloud forests of South America. So there's also a bunch of cool sort of secondary metabolites that these cordyceps and Ophiocordyceps produce. So they can potentially have some like therapeutic and medical benefit. We're still parsing out exactly what those compounds are, but there's some things that are like very potent antioxidants, very potent like anti-cancer drugs, because they can inhibit the synthesis of fast-growing organisms. There's this compound cordycepin, which looks a lot like adenosine, but then it terminates DNA replication. I assume that's one of the things that the cordyceps use to kind of like hijack and manipulate the insect immune system. There's also potentially immunosuppressants. So again, if your immune system was trying to fight off this mycelium, well, the mycelium is probably producing a immune suppressant to take over the sort of system and hijack the immune system of that insect. So pretty wild that they can do that. So that's some of those sort of freakiest, spookiest fungi I could think of. I'm going to give some honorable mentions to some other ones. There's the Helvella elephant saddles. Those are pretty crazy looking. They have these sort of fluted stems. They're sort of in the same family as like morels and Geramitra, Piziza cup fungi, but they are very different from morels because they don't have the kind of honeycomb shape of morel. The flesh is much more tough and not as brittle. The ones I find have black tops, but I found them with kind of white tops as well, which are also sort of freaky little like ghost-like things growing to the forest floor. Helvella do contain some monomethylhydrazine, gyrometrin type stuff, but you can thoroughly cook them and blow some of that off, although I would do that cooking outdoors. And I've found the flavor of Helvella to be okay, kind of mixed in with morels or in cream sauces. It's a little unique. It's a little funky. It can be slightly unpleasant if you get too much of it, but I think in moderation, it's really nice. It's a cool flavor, and I just love finding elephant saddles because they're so sort of nobbled and weird looking, and lots of strange invaginations and these sort of white fluted stems. They look very freaky to me. There's also Gyromitra. Again, those potentially contain quite a bit more gyrometrin and monomethylhydrazine than the Helvellas do, and so they can be more toxic. They're usually a darker brown color, so they're not quite as sort of like unreal freaky looking as the Helvellas, but they can also be just kind of weird, funky, strange looking mushrooms. You have stuff like the phoenix cup, this little purple fungi, purple cup fungi that comes up after fire. So I've seen that here in Napa after the fires. I've also seen a lot of it up in the foothills when I've been up there morel hunting in the spring, but very purple, kind of weird, like shell-like mushroom. That if you blow into it, a bunch of spores will come out, which is always kind of freaky, especially when people think about like Last of Us. On a note of Last of Us, it's a great sci-fi concept where cordyceps-like fungi makes the sort of jump to the human species, so it goes from insects to humans, and then start infecting humans, and they become these sort of crazy zombie-like creatures and clickers, which look very much like Chicken of the Woods. Realistically, it's incredible sci-fi, but it's would probably never happen because fungi are not able to infect our immune system in quite the same way you would as an insect, because we don't have hemolymph. We have a lot more like white blood cells and antigens and things that can fight off a fungal infection. Granted, there are, and I found this out from my friend Rich Tehan, there are a couple of cordyceps species that can infect humans, although they cause like a mild skin rash. So I wouldn't be too worried about turning into a fungal zombie, but it's still great sci-fi, and it's very topical and relevant when we think about spooky fungi. So there's nemicos, which are these very slimy mushrooms, Foliota microspora. I've been growing some of those, and they're kind of like orangey and slimy, and I don't know. I think those are kind of freaky. Those are fun. The sulfur tufts, Hypholoma fasciculare. Those are these bright yellow mushrooms that are pretty common in like wood chip beds, and they glow under UV. This sort of like freaky light greenish yellow color. They'll stain really orange with KOH. So sulfur tufts are pretty wild looking. I like those. Those are a little frightening. The Cytaria, the beach strawberries that have these like weird irregular shaped holes, those can definitely like trigger people's trypophobia. There's Romeria ariospora, which is this just like absolutely like pink, bloody red coral fungus that I think looks really freaky. You know, if a vampire had invented a mushroom, it would probably be Romeria ariospora. And then I think the last one that I love is the beefsteak, Fistulina hepatica. And I found, years ago, I found this like chunk of beefsteak that was like crawling with maggots, and I sliced through it with a knife. And so, like, watching this sort of like bloody foot shaped mushroom like, with all these maggots crawling over it, that's pretty freaky. So there you go. I hope you've enjoyed this kind of overview of some of the freaky, frightening fungi that are out there. There's a whole bunch more that I didn't go into, things that can cause different types of human disease, and I think some of those would be really frightening to think about too, but they're not quite as much fun to look at. So everything I've talked about, you can find pictures of and descriptions on my social media, or by just doing a quick Google search, and hopefully you guys have learned something and maybe gotten a little freaked out by fungi, but don't be too scared, right? If you feel too freaked out by this, go listen to my mycophobia episode, and hopefully that'll help calm you down. So I will, again, be back to do more episodes for you guys. My big push right now is to just be focused on my book and try to figure out how to find balance in my life and be happy. So I appreciate all the good feedback. If you guys enjoyed this episode, please leave me a review. This is on Spotify, Google, Callin, YouTube, and Apple, I believe. So it's on every possible podcast platform that I can think of. And I would love to have your guys' support, whether that is financial and you guys joining my Patreon or buying some merch from my website, or just like liking and sharing my videos. I do have a Pinterest, I have a Twitter, I have a YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok. I think there's even like a Twitch and a Snapchat and all the things in there. If you like my stuff, again, you can check out my website, fastinbyfungi.com. I have mushroom discounts on there, so you can get lots of great mushroom kits and other things like that from North Spore, from Far West Fungi. There's a few other brands on there that I like and I collaborate with. I also have an Amazon storefront, and you can find all my recommendations for books and gear and other mushroom products on there. It's been a real pleasure to talk to you guys again, and I appreciate you all very much. So be well, and sending you all much love. Bye-bye.